It's clear that security and justice are priorities for poor people as well as international agencies across the whole world. Security and justice are quite often seen as prerequisites for broader aspects of development, particularly economic development and the rule of law. And it is a truism almost to say that there can be no development without security and no security without development. Both ideas of security, in particular whose security are we talking about, and whether we're talking about state security, the security of international mechanisms of states, or whether we're talking about human security, and if so, which humans, are all huge subjects of contestation within the literature. And indeed, there's very little agreement amongst different types of analysts and different aid agencies about what exactly it is that everyone is aiming to do when they start talking about the reconstruction of security. In fragile states themselves, the security situation is normally hugely complicated by a multiplicity of different actors. So what you have is a continuously fluid situation of a number of overlapping actors, both state, non-state, and both state and non-state at the same time. And in fact, sometimes the international community's usual emphasis on dichotomies, so state and non-state, traditional, modern, formal, informal, doesn't really help, because in most of the situations where donors then become involved, it's not so much a nice clear system of black and white as much of several shades of grey. In most fragile contexts, the provision of security can involve quite a wide range of actors, and this can cause a great deal of difficulty for international agencies who wish to engage in this field. In particular, there are some that are I suppose more associated with traditional formal security measures. So you talk about ministries of defence, militaries and police in particular. But then even within the formal security structures, you then have structures that may be either forgotten about, so that would usually be prisons and the prison service, and sometimes customs authorities, but also institutions that are traditionally extremely difficult to deal with, like intelligence organisations, but remain critical to the ability of any security system to operate professionally and in good time. At the same time, what you then have is a spectrum between those formally recognised security institutions and a whole series of different actors that go right the way down to community level. These could involve people like vigilantes, as you get in many states in West Africa, which are essentially community support organisations. Vigilantes can either be good or bad. They can either be involved with the sort of criminal activity you can associate with things like drug trading or racketeering, or actually they may just be an expression of a lack of state-provided security in a particular community, where youths are effectively employed as local security guards. That is quite common in many West African situations. What you get between those is a mixture of semi-institutionalized and institutionalized activities that encompass things like traditional authorities. So a chief in West Africa may actually have access to his own, and it will be a he, his own chiefdom police, as well as groups of elders and youths within the local society. At the same time, though, you may well have political parties that organise their own followers, or you may have organisations such as youth leagues of many left-wing parties, or former combatants, so war veterans in a Zimbabwean sense, that operate some form of security, or at least if they don't offer security, they may well threaten security in some way, shape or form. Consequently, when you come to think about aid policy and how international intervention can affect those things, we come across a whole series of issues with the historical approaches being very, very top-down and focused on one end of the spectrum and not really incorporating the other end of the spectrum. So traditional security interventions have quite often been done on a level of institution to institution. So you may well have military trainers from the UK or US or France who go in and work with their equivalents. Now that is absolutely fine at that level. It's when you then go into things like Ministry of Defence partnerships, creating Ministries of Defence that mirror, say, what happens in Whitehall, for example, but you then don't incorporate other security actors within the general environment, that issues start to manifest themselves. In particular, you have to remember that in most of the states where this type of security sector reform happens, the history of the military has not been a happy one. The other problem in terms of intervening in a fragile state is really whose security are we talking about and who provides that security, and whether or not the particular provider of security is an acceptable provider of security that is actually aligned to the values of the person intervening. So as a Western liberal, for example, it is quite difficult for me sometimes to work with people who, for example, don't sign up to particular definitions of human rights or the rights of the child or gender rights, for example. However, in many chiefdom courts, local systems of courts, women, for example, are quite often treated as minors. They don't have the same rights as men. Some things are socially unacceptable to talk about in a local court, even though they are supposed to come within the jurisdiction of that local court. The classic case here is something like marital rape, where there are many institutions in parts of Nigeria, for example, that will not admit that that actually takes place. So there are questions about how you work with organisations that you don't necessarily share the values with, and how you might engage with those, and how you might then end up changing some of the values to reflect a much broader concern about providing human security across a whole range of different people, not just supporting something that's traditional that then, because it's cheap and accessible and there, but then also just continues to provide the traditional form of security that it has. Because traditionally, some groups have benefited from that. The classic groups that have missed out are women and youth. And we see increasing numbers of women being subjected to sexual and gender-based violence. We also see increasing groups of women signing up to violent movements in Liberia and places such as that, as they rebel against this sort of these social structures. But at the same time, the biggest single driver of most of the conflicts within, or the biggest single group within those conflicts, is youth. It's disaffected youth and a revolt against authority and a revolt against these institutions. So we need to be very careful which institutions we get involved with and why and in what ways. One of the other big issues is that we don't really know how well many historical programs have worked. Even on something as big as security sector reform, where the UK has been engaged for a number of years, we actually don't have a very detailed evidence base for a lot of the things that we talk about. There are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, I think these are big historical programs and it takes a long time for some of these changes to come through. I think secondly, there is a real difficulty in establishing causal relationships that allows you to do the sort of research that says, well, we did A and B happened, and the quality of B was X and we wanted it to be Y. I think the idea that this is a long-term project is part of what you learn very quickly. But at the same time, I think it also has to be recognised that this is a phenomenally messy area to work in. That everybody knows that conflict or stopping conflict is important, but actually producing very, very clear data that provides crystal clear evidence about how you do that is incredibly difficult. Given the difficulty in producing very detailed and accurate data, monitoring and evaluation can be extremely difficult in this field. There are things you can do with regard to specific institutional programs. You can say how many people were trained. You can say that an institution was established. You can say that a law was changed, for example, or X number of judges were trained. But it's much more difficult to trace through those changes and the impact of a particular program on the ground. And at the core of all of this is an issue about mixing short-term project outcomes with what are essentially long-term goals. And so anyone engaged with security reforms, I think, has to recognise that you can't go in, reform an entire security system within a time frame of 2 years, 3 years at most, and then produce a report that says this security system is now completely reformed and is functioning. Those security systems, even if you're just talking about the formal security systems, are so embedded into society and are so politicised, because remember, we're talking about usually the first thing that people write down when they define what a state is. These are right at the heart of the political system, and so acting and working politically is critical to making anything happen. And anything that involves acting and working politically is inherently difficult to measure. Within the reading pack, I've given you 6 different types of reading over 6 different subjects. But they try and show you a range of styles of writing in this area. So there are, for example, a number of things published by ODI and various other sort of think tank organisations that are very practical. But at the same time, there are also academic articles that think about how you might map the security and development nexus, as it's called. So what do these relationships actually look like? What evidence do we have about what we're talking about when we talk about the links between security and development? And in the case of the article that I've given you by Stern, he also talks about what's lacking. So what don't we know about this? Where are the gaps in the map, if you like? I then have given you a couple of readings about more specific things, in particular security sector reform and the attempts to broaden out security reform to encompass many more developmental goals that really reflects a change in the definition of security away from the security of states and towards human security, or the security of people.